Himalayas are often called the king of mountains. From these mighty mountains rise countless rivers, rivers that have shaped the geography, history, and civilization of the Indian subcontinent. For centuries, the Himalayas have attracted people with a mysterious kind of pull. Today, that attraction can be seen in the growing culture of trekking, adventure, and mountain tourism. For many, reaching these remote valleys and high passes is an experience they never forget. But even today, traveling through Himalayas is not always easy. A journey that may appear simple on a map can become a difficult, more travel journey through winding mountains, roads, steep valleys, and unpredictable terrain. We are about to talk about Himalayas that creates Uttarakhand. So, what does Uttarakhand's Himalayas really offer? It offers breathtaking scenic beauty, towering peaks, deep valleys, forests, and green mountain lakes. But its beauty is the only beginning. Uttarakhand is also a land of ancient art and tradition, of simple people, of folk tales passed from one generation to another, and of folk songs that preserve memories of a life deeply connected with the mountains. And beneath all of this lies a much older story, a landscape deeply woven into Hindu tradition and mythology, with references found in ancient texts such as Skanda Purana. Perhaps this is why Uttarakhand fits different in the Himalayan region. You don't simply travel through its mountains, you travel through its history, its stories, its faith, and through the lives of people who have called these mountains home for generations. This is the Uttarakhand I discovered while reading the book The Adobe of God by Rani Kapoor. Himalayas have always had a strange power to attract people. For centuries, these mountains have drawn sages, saints, seekers, and pilgrims. Ancient figures associated with Hindu traditions such as Vedvyasa and Adi Sankaracharya are deeply connected with the spiritual imagination of the Himalayas. Centuries later, the tradition continued through modern spiritual leaders such as Neem Karoli Baba, whose ashram at Kanchi became a place of pilgrimage for people from around the world. And remarkably, the attraction of the Himalayas has not been limited to saints and spiritual seekers. The region has also fascinated some of the world's most influential modern personalities like Steve Jobs. This enduring fascination tells us something. People don't come to Himalayas only to see the mountains. Some come looking for adventure, some come looking for God, and some come looking for themselves. And perhaps some simply come because there is something about these mountains that is difficult to explain. But what exactly does Uttarakhand offer? That is where the story becomes much more interesting. There are two conventional gateways through which many travelers enter the hills of Uttarakhand: Haridwar leading towards Garhwal and Kathgodam leading towards Kumaon. But the journey into the mountains does not begin the moment you see the first high peak. It begins in the Tarai, a fertile agriculture belt lying at foothills of the Himalayas. As you move further towards the mountains, the landscape changes. The Tarai gives way to the Babar, a forested belt where the streams and watercourses that descend from the mountains often disappear beneath the porous ground. And then gradually the plains begin to disappear behind you. The road start climbing. The valley becomes narrower, the bends sharper, and journey becomes slower. The buses may not have particularly comfortable, but every turn take you deeper into the mountains. As the altitude rises, the vegetation changes. Around 10,000 feet, the landscape becomes rich with forest and mountain vegetation. Even the old tourist rest houses tells you a story. Many of these old places carries memories of British era and European travelers. But the mountains were never conquered by roads alone. Before modern transport made these journeys easier, animal and human being carried much of the burden of bringing development into the hills. Mules, ponies, and porters worked along with these difficult routes, carrying supplies, equipment, and material through terrain where vehicle could not go, and perhaps this is why a journey on foot has a special pleasure in Himalayas. You walk slowly, you feel the cool mountain breeze, you hear the sound of the forest, and unlike a journey by car, the mountains gradually reveals itself to you. Jim Corbett wrote about this idea of hardship and reward in the mountains. The thought that comfort does not always lead to fulfillment, and the greater, then perhaps the greater the effort, the greater the reward. And in Uttarakhand, this seems particularly appropriate. These mountains do not give themselves to you easily. You have to climb for them, you have to walk for them, and perhaps in doing so, you begin to appreciate them a little more. Trekking into the hills. Today, trekking is one of the most popular ways to experience the Himalayas or any mountain, but trekking in the mountains is not simply about walking. It demands preparation, endurance, and respect for the environment. High altitude sickness, rapidly changing weather, snowfall, difficult terrain, dehydration, and frostbite can turn a beautiful journey into a dangerous one. At extreme altitudes, conditions such as high altitude pulmonary edema can become life threatening. And yet, despite all these risks, people continue to be drawn towards the Himalayas. Why? Perhaps the answer lies deeper than adventure. For Indians, the Himalayas have never been just mountains. In Mahabharata, the Pandavas are said to have journeyed towards the Himalayas on their final journey towards heaven. The mountains also occupy an important place in the tradition associated with Kedarkhand and Manaskand, named deeply connected to the sacred geography of Uttarakhand. The Himalayas are also not a barrier that completely isolated India from the world. Buddhist missionaries crossed these difficult mountain routes, carrying their teachings towards the Tibet and China, and centuries later, Chinese travelers such as Faxian and Xuanzang traveled to India, crossing vast difficult regions in the search of knowledge, scripture, and places associated with Buddhism. So there is something fascinating here. For a modern traveler, the Himalayas may represent adventure. For a pilgrim, they represent faith. For a monk, they may represent spiritual seeking. And for an explorer, they represent the unknown. But this raises an interesting question. Why did the idea of entering the Himalayas simply for trekking and recreational emerges so much later? Perhaps because for much of Indian history, entering these mountains was not considered a leisure activity. The mountains had a purpose. People went there to worship, to meditate, to seek knowledge, to visit sacred places, or to cross them on journeys of necessities. The modern idea of climbing a mountain simply because it is beautiful or walking for days through the wilderness simply for experience belongs largely to a much later culture of exploration and tourism. And what difference is and that difference tells us something important about how Indians have traditionally looked at the Himalayas. We did not always see the mountains as to something to conquer. We saw them as something sacred. There is something about the Himalayas that seems to stir the imagination of human being. Perhaps that is why the mountain eventually became the stage for new age of exploration, the age of mountaineering. Long before climbers began attempting to conquer the highest peaks, the Himalayas were being measured and mapped. During the Great Trigonometrical Survey of India, an Indian mathematician and surveyor, Radhanath Sikdar, calculated the height of a Himalayan peak that was known simply as Peak 15. In 1852, his calculation showed something extraordinary. Peak 15 appeared to be the highest mountain in the world. Its height was calculated at about 29,002 feet. The mountain has later named Mount Everest after George Everest, the former Surveyor General of India. But the mountain already had a name in the region around it. In the Nepal, it was widely known as Sagarmatha, and in Tibet, it was known as Chomolungma. And then began a new chapter in the relationship between humans and the Himalayas, mountaineering. And in this story, Sherpas become indispensable partners. Their extraordinary knowledge of mountains, endurance at high altitude, and experience with terrain made them some of the most important figures in Himalayan expedition. So, there were. Eventually, India too developed its own mountaineering tradition, and these mountains in Uttarakhand naturally became one of the important center for this movement. Its mountains offered everything a mountaineer could ask for: high peaks, glacier, difficult passes, deep valleys, and extraordinary variety of terrain. But perhaps there is another reason people continue to climb. It is not always about reaching the summit. It is simply the call of the mountains, a call that makes a person have to leave the comfort of the plains, carry a heavy backpack, walk for days through difficult terrain, and willingly place themselves in an environment where nature is far more powerful than human beings. So, the challenge, because Himalayas challenge us precisely how small we are compared to nature. Himalayas are not merely a geographical feature. For millions of people, they are sacred. In the Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna says, "Among the mountains, I am the Himalaya." Perhaps no other statement captured the place of the mountains in the Indian civilization quite so beautifully. But the Himalayas are also a remarkable story written in the language of geology. The mountains we see today were born from an extraordinary collision of the continents. What was once the ancient Tethys Sea lay between the Indian and Eurasian landmasses. As the Indian plate moved to northward and collided with the Eurasian plate, the sediment of that ancient sea were folded, compressed, and uplifted over millions of years. And the process has not yet stopped. The Himalayas are still being shaped by geological forces, rising, eroding, fracturing, and changing. Stretching across the northern edge of the Indian subcontinent, the Himalayan system forms an enormous arc from the region of the Indus in the west towards the Brahmaputra in the east. And Uttarakhand occupies a remarkable section of the great mountain systems. Himalayas in Uttarakhand are home to some of the India's most magnificent peaks like Nanda Devi, Kamet, Trisul, Nanda Ghunti, Sudarshan, Sivling, Bandarpur, Chokama, Nilkant, and Bhagirathi groups of peaks. Each of these mountains has its own character, its own landscape, and in many cases, its own mythology. The Himalayas themselves are commonly divided into three broad parallel systems like Greater Himalayas, Lesser or Middle Himalayas, and the Outer Himalayas. And the mountains are not simply rock and snow. They contain an extraordinary diversity of flora and fauna, from subtropical forest in the lower elevation to the temperate forest and alpine meadows higher up. The changing altitude creates completely different ecosystem within relatively sourced distances. Animals such as the snow leopard, Himalayan monal, musk deer, and Himalayan thar are part of this remarkable mountain ecosystem. But perhaps the greatest gift of the Himalaya is something we all depend upon: water. The mountain act as an enormous natural reservoir. Snow and glacial store waters, while rainfall and melting snow feed rivers that descend towards the plain. The rivers are originating in the Himalayas sustain agriculture, forest, wildlife, and hundreds of the million of the people downstream. In the sense, the Himalayas are not only the divine king of the mountains, they are also one of the great life support system of the Indian subcontinent. And Uttarakhand sits right in the heart of this extraordinary world. The land, the people, and the Himalayas creates a unique place in Indian subcontinent. Uttarakhand is often described as a land of pilgrimage, but beneath its temple and sacred roads lies traces of much older civilization. The landscape itself is scattered with reminder of the past ancient temples, archaeological remains and settlement spread across the mountains. Places such as Laka Mandal, Kharali, Trijugi Narayan, Kedarnath, Madhyamaheshwar, Adibadri, Dwarahat, Jageshwar, Bageshwar, Bajnath and Champawat preserve fragments of the long history. Some are associated with kingdoms and dynasties, others survive through religious tradition, legend, and folklore. And the history of Uttarakhand is not confined to its archaeological remains. Travelers from distant land also passed through the region. Chinese Buddhist traveler Xuanzang, for example, traveled through northern India and named Haridwar as the ancient city of Mayapur. This mixture of history, mythology, and living tradition is what makes Uttarakhand particularly fascinating. So, the Gadwal of Uttarakhand occupies a special place in Hindu tradition because they are both Shiva and Vishnu are woven deeply into this landscape. The mountains themselves become part of the mythology here. A river, a cave, a spring, or a mountain peak can carry a story that has been passed down for generations. The Mahabharata has especially strong presence in the folklore of Gadwal. Stories of the Pandavas survived in the village's tradition, local place names and temple and folk performances. The region's sacred geography is also closely connected with tradition recorded in the text of Skanda Puran, particularly inscriptions associated with Kedarkhand. But alongside mythology, developed other history, the history of kingdoms and the history of peoples. There were kingdoms in the Chand, like Chand rulers in Kumaon and Katyuris, while Gadwal developed its own kingdoms under the Gadwal kingdom. These kingdoms shaped the temples, settlements, culture, and political identity of the region. But when Britishers take control, they brought new systems of administration, roads, forest, trade, and economic change. But it also altered the traditional relation between mountain communities and their forest and resources. And through all these changes, the ordinary people of Uttarakhand continued to build their lives around the mountains because it was largely a agricultural society. People developed way of surviving in an environment where the land offered beauty but demanded hard work in return. Perhaps this is one of the most remarkable characteristics of Uttarakhand. Its society was not simply shaped by the kings or conquerors or pilgrims. It was shaped by the ordinary mountain people who generation after generation learn how to live with the mountain and to understand Uttarakhand. We therefore have to look into people beyond the temples and peaks. We have to look at its villages, farms, forests, and stories and songs about the people.